Thank you, Dan.
Okay, we are live.
Excellent. Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Nene. Good evening, everyone, and it's good to see you all. And why don't we start the meeting with a roll call? Nene, please.
Yes, Max Starks,
Here.
Samalid Hogan, Lori Martin,
Here.
Norm Roldan,
Here.
and Jeff Sattler.
Here.
Great. Thank you, Nene. And so why don't we jump right into our investment subcommittee report with Lori Martin.
Yep. So the investment subcommittee met on February 1st. All the members, well, the member was present. And Fiduciant gave an overview of capital market assumptions as well as their asset allocation modeling. They talked about our year-to-date performance and our quarterly performance, which is very strong. The long-term fund performed 9.3% and the versus a benchmark of 9.5%. The fiscal year to date, 5.5%, so strong performance. They went through a review of the short-term fund, returning 1.9 for the quarter and 3.1 fiscal year to date. And then we talked about the cash position, there will be a further discussion about liquidity and good problem to have that we have some additional funds potentially to invest. And that was what was discussed.
Thank you, Lori, for that report. Any questions? I guess there's one question from me. Was there any talk about any adjustments that need to be made to the portfolios?
Yes, we did. Not changes to the portfolio. The asset allocation was discussed and things are in line as far as allocation goes. I think there was a couple of underlying funds that they might make some changes to. But that was it.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Lori. Moving on, we can go to our trust funds report. Mr. Chudrin.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. So we have 3 quarters of trust fund reports to present. So I'll try and run through these, but again, willing to take any questions that come up. The 3 quarters include the FY23 fourth quarter report and then the first 2 quarters for FY24. And just a very brief background, we do provide these reports each quarter. We do have 3 trust funds. We have the General Education Trust, the Health Trust, and the Capital Improvement Trust. The fourth quarter trust fund is, if you're wondering why you're seeing it now, it's usually presented after the financial statements are approved. And as you might recall, our financial statements were approved in November, and so this is our next meeting. Also, as a reminder, as this is a trust fund view, it looks differently than our financial statements. So there's a number of things that you won't see here, such as state appropriation, grants, investment income, HERF funds, COVID expenses, not that you would see that this year, but that would be for FY23, and depreciation. So getting into the Gen Ed Trust Fund for the fourth quarter, there's just a couple of items that I'd like to bring to your attention. Student tuition and fee revenue was up. Again, I don't think that's a surprise to anybody, and that's due to enrollment coming in higher than budgeted. If we go through a couple of the other revenue lines, you'll see zeros under the actual amount for the foundation scholarship funding and capital and fellowship funding. That was agreed that those funds would not be provided to the college last year. And also there wasn't a need to use reserves. So that explains some of the zeros that you see in the actuals column. And dropping down into the expenses, you'll see a 0 also for the NN construction line. And again, we always spend our carryover funds first. Also, last year, we did have, we wanted to make sure that we spent down the state appropriation. Anything that you don't spend with the state appropriation, it's either a use it or lose it. You will see some NN expenses when we get to the Capital Improvement Trust, however. So those are some of the items that I wanted to call out from the Gen Ed Trust Fund. Are there any questions on that before we move to the health? Okay, if we can move to the next slide. For the health, everything was pretty much in line on the health trust fund. The one item I'd like to call out is just the clinic fees. That's coming in, well above budget, and that's primarily due to a function of conservative budgeting. Again, coming out of COVID, not knowing what to plan for from the clinic fees, but everything else really fell in line with expectations. And if we can continue to the Capital Improvement Trust. Again, this is just similar to what we saw with the Gen Ed. The capital improvement revenues are up as enrollment was up. You do see some of your expenditures in the NN capital improvements line. And some of those funds are going to be carrying forward to next year. But again, there was no surprises in that line. And if we can move forward to the next slide. This is our vendor expenditure report, which shows all of our vendors that we paid $20,000 or more to during the fiscal year. We do have a couple of call outs where we identify if any part of the expense will be capitalized or was capitalized as through the with the financial statements, and if any of the funding was provided by DCAM. So you'll see those indicated in the right two columns. So I'll pause to see if there's any questions on the fourth quarter report. And if not, what I would like to recommend is, so as not to be too redundant, I'd recommend that we move past the first quarter report and get into the second quarter report, as that's going to be, more current information.
Yes, agree.
Perfect. Okay. So on the first quarter Gen Ed Trust Fund report, again, you're going to see that the student tuition and fee revenues are up. Again, enrollment's coming in better than what was budgeted. The specific course fees line, again, you're going to see a 0 on that line. That's because the course fee is going to be implemented or is implemented as of the spring semester. So on the third quarter report, you'll start to see that line populated. The reserves, again, we won't use the reserves, or we won't recognize that until it's needed, if it's needed. So that's reflecting a 0 as well. And if we scroll down to the expenses, you'll notice, again, we have the NN line showing up as 0. Again, we spend the carryover funds first. Same with our IT capital projects. The very last expenditure line, we're going to be spending our carryover funds for IT before we get into the current year's budget. But generally, everything through the second quarter for the Gen Ed Trust seems to be in line. And if we're actually on the vendor expenditure report, if we can go back just 2 slides. Yep, perfect. The Health Trust Fund. Health Trust Fund is in line with expectations. There's really nothing to call out on the Health Trust. And we can move to the next slide for the capital improvement. Again, you're going to see the revenue is coming in a little bit higher than budgeted, which for reasons that we just discussed. Same with the NN capital line. We'll be spending those down once we spend the carryover funds first. And then the very next slide is our vendor expenditures through the second quarter. Again, anyone that's 20,000 or greater. Are there any questions on any of the trust fund reports?
Not from me, John. I went through it earlier and no questions. It looked pretty straightforward as you described.
Yep.
Any other questions? Okay. Thank you, John. Appreciate it. Now we can turn to our financial update and outlook with Andrea.
Yep. And I'll start off with the cash flow and then turn it right over to Andrea. For the cash, you'll see that we have the cash balance as of February 3rd at TD was approximately $13.9 million. We do have the first large spring financial aid disbursement coming up. That's going to take place next week, where we'll call those funds down. So you'll see a little bit of a spike in cash, bringing us up to $16 million. And as Trustee Martin made reference to, we did have a call with Fiduciant and consulted with them considering our cash balance. And it was determined that we would be transferring $5 million to Fiduciant so they can invest that into our short-term account. So that'll all take place by the end of this week. And once that happens, this graph will be reduced by 5 million. So the projection for June 30th will be reduced from about 10 million that you're seeing there to about 5 million at the end of the year.
My question. So thanks for that.
Good. Yep. No
There's
problem.
a lot of cash sitting here.
Yes, and we're going to put it to work for us.
Perfect.
Yep. And then the next slide just gives us a summary of the actual expenditures that have taken place up through February 3rd. It'll also show you the projection from February 4th through the end of the year, and then the total actual and projected on the far right column. Are there any questions on cash? Okay. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Andrea for the enrollment update. Thank you.
All right, thanks, John. If we can go to the next slide, please. Just wanted to give a quick update on enrollment. So this slide, we've looked at this before. It shows the net financial impact of various enrollment scenarios. So just to orient you to the slide, if you go all the way to the left, that's the budget. So all the way on the left is the approved balanced budget with fall at 4.5% behind last year and spring down 4.5% from last year. Obviously, that's not where we are. If you kind of look at the other columns, where we are sitting now. So the projection that Jason will share in a few minutes is using something close to what's in column C. So the scenario C here, which is fall at actual, which was up about 14%, I think, and spring at 15% above last year. And if you look at, we had a budget, since we budgeted 4.5% down, it's 19.5% up. So the financial impact of that increase in enrollment is about $2.3 million. So that's a significant increase in this year's budget, and you'll see that in the projection that in a few minutes. But one thing to note, there's always like another side of this. So even if you took, we'll see in our multi-year projection in a few minutes that we're going to look at something closer to scenario B here at about like just under 86,000 credits. So even if that B scenario holds true at 86,000 credits, in future years, the projected FY27 deficit, for example, would still be at 4.8 million. So even though this is looking much better than scenarios that we looked at last year, where we were looking at like a $7 million deficit, but still, we're keeping an eye on the future. And so when we start looking at budget and sort of preparing for, a balanced budget in the future, we still need to keep that in mind. So we'll look again at some enrollment trends later, but just wanted to point out that, what's in the projection that Jason will be talking about is really the scenario C. And, but just wanted to give you some context for that. So I think that, any questions on this before we pass it on to Jason? All right. Thanks.
All right, if we could advance to the next slide, please. Great. This is our detailed version of the revenue and spending report, which has been provided to everybody for reference. If we can skip to the summary slide, we can talk about some of the highlights. So as Andrea mentioned, this projection assumes 87,653 credits, with fall up 14%, spring up 15%, and summer assumed at level. So we have a favorable variance of $831,000 overall, made up of revenues that are higher than anticipated of 1.14 million and additional expenses of 311,000. In the revenue section, some of the key changes is that we received in the state appropriation line an additional $504,000 of formula funding. Tuition and fees, we had about $3.1 million in additional revenue due to enrollment. And that enabled us to eliminate the need for the $2.5 million in reserves that we originally used to balance our budget. For expenses, our full-time salaries are down $535,000. That's made up of full-time salaries and positions that were unfilled of 1.13 million, and then additional expenses of 595,000 for unbudgeted payroll increases. We also have part-time salaries that's up $984,000 for adjuncts, and that's related to the enrollment increase. Any questions?
I'd like to see that we're not using those reserves. It feels really good, guys, and that the numbers did help. And we, I know we're being cautious too here, and with that, we're doing it right. So I like the numbers; they look better than they were last year, as we all know.
That's very well said, Trustee Rodon. So, question for me: the unfilled positions, how many do we have unfilled?
I mean, it's varied throughout the year, but probably 20 to 25 throughout the year.
Got it. Thank you.
Oh, can we advance to the next?
Yeah, any other questions for Jason? Okay, so it's budget time. Let me just check in with, I can't see everyone here. Hold on a sec. I just want to see if Dr. Cook wanted to say anything before I get started.
I can't help myself. Just a few comments, everybody. Great to see you. Thanks for the reschedule again. And clearly, to trustees, our finance team really paves the way here. A few things. So obviously, to the point made by Trustee Roldan, there's an overall health here. From really, it's hard not to now with 2 semesters point to Mass Reconnect and Free Community College. I mean, this is what a major policy change in Massachusetts results in. And I even have to then remind myself, and yet we're still just under $1 million to the positive with those kinds of significant enrollment jumps. I mean, 14%, and we're really more like 18% this spring. So to see that, right, your safety net of our reserves is really, really important to us, and that's a good practice going forward. But to know that's how much we are still needing to right size is, I think, a pretty significant consideration for us. So again, really helpful to have these ledgers, these overall health here, but we're going to have to continue to be active managers, of course, with our operations. To Andrea's point, yes, the framing of the red ink in multiple fiscal years down the road isn't 7+ million, but we certainly still have our eyes on the number there. It'd be nice to get that in terms of year in and year out, much closer to more like $1.5 or $2 million, things that we have different levers that are sort of less drastic to have to move towards. So we're thinking about that. And we also have to be mindful, again, I share this with this committee and I'll share this with the full board. Mass Reconnect is still subject to an annual appropriation process by the legislature and the governor. So that could all change again this year, and we could be back to square one on what an enrollment trend might look like. Similarly, there might be a ceiling on all of this. All the adults that we were trying to come back and say, hey, here's a chance for you to, treat your time as valuable this way. We may get to a height of where this enrollment will take us. So again, all of that is just framing for, it's such a different way to come to you with assumptions than in the past years where it was like, not great news, not great news, not great news. So thrilled to turn it back over to Andrea for some of that additional framing. I appreciate it.
Great, thank you. So it's budget time again. It feels like it wasn't that long ago when we were just doing this, but here we are. So just a reminder of our schedule in terms of our timeline for working on the budget. So today we'll look at some preliminary assumptions. Today's really preparation for the budget process. So in the March, April, and May meetings, we'll look at the first, second, and third drafts of the budget, with the May draft submitted as a balanced budget for committee approval. For today, we're really prepping in terms of talking about like having some context for where we need to get to and what are some of the levers we can adjust as we try to reconcile the budget. So that's kind of where we are today. And also a reminder that, we had this multi-year plan to support operations with reserves. And just a reminder that for FY25, that amount is $2 million. And so I think that we will do better than that in the final budget. But just a reminder that, the plan did include the $2 million revenue from reserves in FY25. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. Oh, and the next one. Okay, so let's just start out with assumptions. So as we've done the last few years, we're going to begin the budget discussion with a multi-year analysis. We're sharing a 3-year analysis this year. Oops, I don't know what's happened to the slides there. Okay, let's see. So there should be a bunch of slides in between what looks like slide 30 and 31.
I think they got deleted real quick.
All right. If necessary, I don't know if I
Give me 1 second. I just got to grab the packet again. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Can you hit undo?
Maybe.
That's always my saving grace.
Well, I don't want to hit undo and then get rid of the money, right? That we gain.
Oh, I don't want to
No,
go back
that
that
works.
far.
I don't go back that far.
Just hit it
We can kinda
once.
do this. We can do this walking back, but I can do them like backwards. We can start at the end.
I think undo is working.
Oh, that's gonna be a tricky one anyway. It's not. I think we lost some of our.
We did.
Okay, but
Is
we'll
it
be
not
okay.
working?
We'll be okay. I think it's one more.
There we go.
Okay.
There it is. Yep.
This is
Okay.
where we are. We're good.
Okay,
right.
sorry about that.
No problem. All right. So, we have this sort of monster Excel spreadsheet. Jason developed this model that allows us to project out multiple years, putting in various assumptions so that we can see what the future, could look like under different scenarios. So what we're going to show today, you'll see on the next slide, we'll look at a few years out, but just to talk about, we start with we basically do this projection, assuming that operations stay the same over the years that we're looking at. And, if we don't make any changes and, we make assumptions about revenue and expense inflation, what happens to our bottom line? And so the state appropriation in this model, we're taking the FY24 known appropriation, and then we're just inflating that just by 1.5% each year, which normally is a pretty conservative assumption. I'm not sure about this year, so we'll talk about that later. For enrollment, we're going to use an FY25 and 26 and 27 credits at just under 86,000, which is 2% down from what we're projecting for this year. We just don't know, if Mass Reconnect is going to. We don't know what. If Mass Reconnect is going to be funded the same way next year, et cetera. So we're just not sure what that looks like. Again, I think that's pretty conservative. We have no increases to tuition and fees in these projections. Staffing levels are held steady. Salaries are inflated by 3% per year, plus any, contractually obligated other types of increases. Operational and other expenses were inflating by 4% in 25 and then 3% thereafter. And then the facilities and IT, project funding is held steady at 4.7 million. And so for now, those are the assumptions. So if we go on to the next slide, we can see what that looks like. And so here, if you, the column on the left is the projection. So the FY24 projection is what Jason just showed, the 831,000 positive that we're looking at without any use of revenue from reserves. As we sort of extend out FY25, we can see that we start out with about a $2.5 million deficit. In FY26, that grows to 3.8 million. In FY27, the deficit grows to 4.8 million. So you can see that, when I look at this, I'm saying, I'm not too concerned about the FY25 budget as a standalone. We know that we could use 2 million from reserves. We're hoping not to do that. I think that we'll do better than that. But when I look at FY27 and I see 4.8 million, that's the number I'm focusing on. I'm kind of looking past 25 and looking out to 27, because we said that we needed to be balanced in FY27 without revenue from reserves. So let me just stop there and see if there are any questions about this, because this is really just provided for context, but just want to make sure we're, you know, on the same page. Any questions here?
No, I like the fact that the projection is there, and I like the way you focus in the future there. And that in reality, we have to plan that way anyway. So we don't ever know what's the unknowns, right? So I like that.
I have a
Andrea,
question.
this is Jeff. I have a question for you.
Yeah.
How many credit hours do we need to meet the 27 projection to not have a loss?
You know what?
Or-
I have a slide that there's a couple slides ahead, and I will show that to you. So good
Thank you.
question.
I have a question.
Yes.
And I know we talk about this more on internal, external, as far as like personnel, retirements, et cetera. But since salaries and benefits are on this slide, do we have any retirements or anything coming up that will impact the salaries and benefits or like decrease that item?
Yes. So that, and just a reminder for on this slide, this is as if nothing changed. So we know that there are some things we know will happen that aren't reflected here yet. There are some things that we can impact, you know, we can make decisions that will change these numbers. And, you know, that will impact these numbers. So this is a conservative starting point. But, so at the end, these, you know, the expense numbers in particular will likely be, reduced. Does that answer your question?
I just wanted to note too that we have done things like last year, we did a retirement incentive, hoping to use all the tools in the toolbox, and that did not really yield. I think I've shared with trustees, or perhaps this might be new news for Lord Martin too, but people can give a year's notice for some of the incentives that are built into their collective bargaining agreements, but they're not obligated to see it through. So we have almost like a holding pattern where some people have given us notice, and then sometimes it's a 50-50 chance whether they see it through or actually stay with us again. So there's a never quite sure until the summer sometimes about where some of the personnel carry lands.
Yeah, and for that reason, and that's true for many different categories of expenses. So, you know, my answer here in terms of, you know, what could change, you know, any of these different categories, you know, could be different. And so that's why we start with this conservative assumption, because we would rather have positive surprises later than negative surprises later. So that's really just the philosophy going into this.
My question is primarily on what Trustee Sadler asked, but just in a different way, which is, you know, what levers do we have? And I mean, I like the forward looking, but at the end of the day, we have to, given we have time, what do we need to do, right, to get to a balanced budget, right? That's our ultimate goal. And it looks like the one lever we have is the tuition and fee line. Like to your point, Andrea, like we'll get some movement on some of these items. There'll be immaterial here or there, but we're talking about basically $5 million off. Like what levers do we truly have? And kind of if we approach it that way, we might not be able to put a complete dent in the 5 million, but we can do something to help us get there rather than saying, oh, we give up, we got to get from reserves.
Absolutely. And actually, if we go to the next slide, that kind of lists out sort of what we haven't considered yet and what we can consider. So just like you were saying, so in terms of the state appropriation, as Dr. Cook was explaining, we can't control that, but we're sort of looking out for signs of what that will be. And so that's usually something we usually stick with a pretty conservative assumption, even into the final version of the budget. But, you know, enrollment, we're the current assumption here is somewhat conservative. If spring and summer end up better than we expected, we could, you know, go in with a less conservative assumption on enrollment. Tuition and fees, again, trustees are able to potentially approve fee increases. And there's a slide specifically on that later where we can have a conversation about that. But for the gen ed fee, let's say, which is a per credit fee for every student, you know, every $1 increase in that fee with the current assumption on credits would give us $86,000 in revenue. So you can see how a $5 or a $10 fee increase per credit would have an impact. In terms of full and part-time staffing, you know, every budget cycle, I mean, we're constantly sort of reviewing that, but, you know, every budget cycle, we look closely at salaries by division. We take advantage of attrition over time, you know, either retirements or other, you know, when people resign, we try to, you know, create efficiencies. And so we'll look at that as we do every year. And then operational and other expenses. Right now, the model does not have us absorbing inflation, but we could make an assumption, for instance, that we don't add inflation to budgets, and people need to, different departments need to, find expenses to absorb that inflation. So that's an option here. And then, we can look at our facilities and IT budgets. There's a slide on that later, that will tend to push out, we can push out projects and but I don't know that we need to do that in the current, to reconcile the FY25 budget, but we should look at that longer term. So I don't know if this helps answer some of those questions about like, what are the things we can look at? And we can get more specific about a few of these going forward. Any questions or comments here? Okay, if not, we can go on to the next slide, please. You know what? We're going to skip this slide because we can't see it. We'll stick with this one. So this is getting to Trustee Sattler's question earlier. So on this slide, just to orient you, so this shows the impact of different enrollment scenarios. So if you look at the orange, I don't know if it even looks orange today, but the middle bars are the ones that look like brownish orange. That reflects the numbers that we've been looking at. So with using a floor of 85,900 credits, you can see the deficits of 2.5 million, 3.8 million, and 4.8 million. If we actually have enrollment decline by 3% per year, that's where you get the blue bars, and that goes down to by FY27 a $5.8 million deficit versus the 4.8. If we increase the enrollment's assumption by 3% per year, you can see the green bars, and that would bring us to 3.2 million. So even with a 3% increase every year for 3 years, we still have that deficit of 3.2 million using, with this scenario. So, to get to break even in FY27, we need to be at 115,000 credits compared to the 85.9 that's in this current model. So that would take us back to FY17 levels, so pre-COVID. And to get there, that would require a 10% annual growth for 3 consecutive years. So that would be somewhat of a challenge. I mean, this year we've had a big jump, but it doesn't seem like that would likely be sustainable. So, the real message here is that we really can't count on growing our way out of this structural deficit. We need to have a combination of enrollment strategies, but also really, strategies that look at cost and matching costs with revenue. So, that's really the picture here. So I'll just stop there and see if there are any questions or comments.
Andrea, this is Jeff picking up on that thought. So the real question is, with your budget, you're looking at keeping the same amount of credits or increasing them, but not talking about price increase. And everybody's, inflation is where it's at. Are you looking at increasing per credit hour pricing as well to meet or at least get to that 2027 budget without dipping into the fund? I think that there's a lot of work to be done on that, but I think that's my thought.
Yeah, and that's consistent with where I'm going, which is, what do we have to do? Like, we're looking at 10%, we're saying, oh, it's not achievable, and it's not achievable if we don't try. So what does trying look like? Now, you're not going to know right here. I'm not asking to answer the question now, but the next time we get together, like what are the things we would have to do? It might not work, but at least I'd rather say, hey, these are all the things that we need to get revenue up, but realizing revenue goes up, expense goes up as well. But when you put it all together, literally, this is what we think is our best attempt to get at a flat budget in 2027, and then we can pull it back and say, you know what, we're with you. We can't do that. Then we scale it back. But without seeing the effort to get there, it's hard to opine.
I was going to say that you look at this, it's almost, you're looking at one item in a silo, right? So is there a slide that shows all the assumptions that are all the levers that we could pull and the plus or minus 3% for all of them? Like, see it all the sensitivities on one page?
You know, those are really good points. We don't have that today, but we can certainly do that. I mean, the model is dynamic, so we can go into the model and we can change multiple things. And if there are specific things you want to see, we can certainly run that through, but because it's sort of an infinite number of combination of things, we don't have that. If you have a suggestion about like how you want to see it, we're happy to show it that way. But that is true. So this is really that's true. This is really isolating the impact of how enrollment impacts the finances. But if we at the same time increase fees, obviously that would change the picture here as well. Or if we absorb inflation, that would change it as well. So we can do all of those things. So I think that when we go into next month, when we come to the committee, we'll come with the looking specifically at the FY25 budget, and we'll come with specific strategies and sort of work our way toward a balanced budget by May. But we can talk about, if we do this, then that will impact this way. We may choose between things like increasing fees or decreasing expenses, or different levels of doing both of those things. So, I think that there's a lot of nuance there. And, that's what, that's where it gets interesting. But, so, if there's anything in particular, today that you want to see next time, let me know. Or if you think of something in between now and then, let me know. We'll try to present that.
Andrea, this is Jeff. I really respect what you just said, and it's right. This is the initial pass of what the budget's going to look like. All I'm saying is, looking at 27, let's figure out 25. We know there's got to be a price increase per credit hour at some point in time. I love the idea of keeping our students not in a position where they have to fight inflation, right? But there is a reasonable side here, whether it's 25, 6, or 7, to consider all of the expenses, all of the revenue, and what a price increase looks like, so we don't have to dip into any kind of a cash position in 27. We're soon, it's early. I know what you're saying. I'm just throwing that out there as just a thought for you to look at. That's all.
I appreciate that.
Let me just chime in and say that's helpful, trustees, because when you are signaling to us that you can't support, frankly, you have the appetite for that fee increase, that allows us to know how and whether we can move that forward. We'll certainly always couch it like we have. Again, Trustee Starks has seen this now for a number of years. We'll put it in the context of Pell. When you see the percentage or the per credit increase, how does that map against a student that is full financial aid, if you will, for grants, not loans? We will definitely show that. But when you are saying yes, definitely look at revenue increases, that certainly helps us take some of the guesswork out of knowing where you are on that key item. Thank you.
So we do have a couple slides coming up we have one on fees, one on enrollment. If any other questions on this one, or should we move on? Okay, let's move on. So just the next one. So we'll talk about a few specific items. So here's just the enrollment trend. So for, just as a reminder, I think it's helpful to see that, this slide just gives us some helpful context around where we are with enrollment compared to where we have been. So, here's a history. If you look all the way to the left, in 2013, that was the peak of 142,000 credits. There was an average decline between then and sort of the COVID times of about a 4.5% drop per year. And then we hit COVID, and there was a big drop, and we were sort of hovering around that lower number. And then this year, all of a sudden, there was the pop up. So, that's why we're not quite sure what the future looks like. And so, looking at projecting out at, this floor of just under 86,000 credits. And so, when we come back with the first draft of the budget, it will probably, assume a similar number to this. I don't know that would change in the next few weeks, but just wanted to give you this kind of reference point. Any questions on the enrollment? If not, we can go on to the next slide, please. And here's the history on fees. So this is a history of fees going back to FY17. And you can see that we had, prior to COVID, it was common to have annual fee increases. Just to orient you to the slide. So just if you look at one column on the bottom, there's $25. That's the tuition, the state sort of regulated tuition. And that's been $25 a credit, I don't know how long, someone else on the screen, John or Jason probably know what that is. I don't know, like before 2017. So really what, we do have control over are the different types of fees. And so the biggest piece there is the gen ed fee, where you can see it was 165 for a while, then went up to 175 as of this spring. And so, we had these small increases, for about 3.5 years, kept the fees steady. And then last year, trustees approved a $10 per credit increase that was effective this spring. So not in the fall, but in spring. And so, this is really where, we can look at, so what's the impact, not only for FY25, but going into the future. So, to the point about, what are our levers to impact what happens, let's say in FY27, a fee increase in FY25 will carry forward. And so, definitely something that we should talk about. The other types of fees, if we go to the next slide, we can see that we not only have these gen ed fees, or fees that are charged to every student, but we also have some program specific fees. And there's also a chance to look at these. So in the health, students in the health programs have a per semester fee of $840. The health sciences students have fees. Last year, trustees approved a $100 per semester fee for STEM students. So these are really, focused on the programs that have higher costs. So instead of charging these additional fees to everyone, it's a way to generate some revenue to offset specific costs and specific programs. And so this is also another potential lever, is to see whether these particular fees are at the right level, or if there are any other types of fees, any other high cost programs that, we should be charging additional fees for. So I'll just stop there and see if there are any questions about fees, either for this slide or the slide before.
We have access to benchmarking data on different fees for community colleges.
We probably do. We tend to look within the state to see, what do our peer institutions do? What are they doing for both increases in a given year? And then, do they also have similar either program specific fees, or, what are their gen ed fees? So,
And I would offer just very briefly that the 15 community colleges cluster pretty tightly, which is to say we are actually pretty close to what places like Boston might be charging, but also the Berkshires. So there's not a lot of spread. And I can also share that the most closest community college just up the north, we are slightly below their fee structure, as I understand it.
any other questions about fees? We'll have more of a chance to talk about fees next month as well. Okay, so if we can go to the next slide, please. Okay, so here, the real message here, so the pie chart shows our projected FY25, the expenses in the FY25 projection by category. And so, the real message here is that, we know the continued deficits are not sustainable. The solution really requires aligning expenses with revenue. And so, when we look at the different categories of expenses, we just need to, be reminded that, all the blue sections of the pie here, when you add them together, those are all salary related. And that's 67% of the total budget, with 49% of the total expense budget just full-time salaries, 14% in part-time, which includes adjunct salaries, and then there's another 4% in salary related expenses like benefits. And so we obviously look at all different types, all different categories of expenses for appropriate reductions, but this is really just a reminder that it's hard to reconcile the budget without looking at salaries, and so we do look at that. And so just any questions on this? Okay.
Andrea, I do have a question. I'm sorry to
Yes.
interrupt.
Sure.
I'm looking at, when you look at those salary ranges, which is a good part of the budget, could you look at the analysis of what salary increases have been over the last 3 to 4 years, given that we have not increased our per credit enrollment costs, and how that has affected the impact on operation and utilities, IT, and other expenses? when you look at the entire budget. You know that there is salary increases because of inflation and all the contracts that we have. So in real dollars, what does that look like over the last 3 or 4 years relative to what you're looking at in 2025? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, we can certainly do that. I don't know that we've taken that particular look, like sort of mapping salary increases against, let's say, increases of other expenses or increases in revenue. But that's, we do look at that occasionally.
I
Okay.
mean, I would share, and again, for our newer trustees, I would say, right, this has been a very difficult conversation, having 50% of our budget in full-time salary. This has been a really hard point of conversation for the better part of 4 years. I would even say, Jeff, a couple things come to mind with that as a preference. One is having really lived this budget, right? We've been pretty well pegged at about 50% of our budget for many years now is our full-time salaries. And you've got two collective bargaining agreements that have some impact on that.
Right.
So there is some elements that are truly well and beyond our control with how they are bargained and negotiated, and that they still influence, and we've been able to manage and control cost when and how we can. We have a group of exempt employees, right? That, the whole point is, even with an enrollment decline that we've seen, and you saw the trend, 40+% over a decade, our folks in IT would say it's not like their work got any simpler during that enrollment decrease. And in fact, they might say it's actually got more complicated and more difficult. So our FTEs in some of these key areas have been very difficult to reduce as part of the sort of overall piece. What I would say is, again, candidly, because I've had to be public about this, when I started in 2016, we had over 150 full-time faculty. We have, give or take, about 118 full-time faculty now. Again, not the kinds of conversations that are easy to have in open meeting, and they certainly bring forward past conversations that have been really hard. But I offer that as part of the way in which we have tried to manage this because of such significant enrollment declines mapped against to how you carry that kind of salary. I do hope that that's helpful.
I respect exactly what you said, Dr. Cook, especially in the last 2 years, we still balanced the budget with that kind of enrollment decline and maintaining salaries at 67% of the total costs, which is great because we're not really dipping into that reserve that we thought we would have to at this point in time, which is outstanding. But reality is there is salary increases. There's 3%. There's like you say, collective bargaining. There is a cost of paying people the right grade as inflation impacts without increasing fees and impacting the other expenses that we have. And I think that at some point in time, there is that reality of maintaining the appropriate salaries and the adjunct, the part-time, appropriately as our student enrollment grows. So I'm just throwing it out there. It's the initial conversation, but these are the thoughts I have going into the 25 budget.
Sure, that the other colleges are going some similar heartaches that we're going through, but they're probably looking at their fees as well. But I think overall we've done a great job with this too as well. So
Absolutely.
And I definitely hear different conversations about the philosophy about using reserves. And again, you see, we have really done well to beat that fact that you provide us with that safety net, and we're beating that position with how we're managing year in and year out. We know we want to keep that approach going. But again, I hear things anecdotally. You try to compare notes with your colleagues when you can, but other community colleges are very much still needing that reserve allocation to arrive at balance in their fiscal year.
Any other questions about this? Okay, we're almost at the end. A couple more slides. So if we can go to the next one, please. Okay, this is really just a reminder of the, because we have a significant investment annually in facilities and IT and cybersecurity. So on the facility side, We're still at this point including an annual facilities, essentially project budget of 3.1 million. That really covers campus master plan priorities, ongoing maintenance and emergencies. And that's also supplemented by the DCAM critical repairs funding, which we get an allotment for 5 years. So the current allotment is FY 24 to 28. And it totals $11.1 million. So sort of averages about 2.2 million per year. On the IT side, it was only in FY 22 that we formalized an annual capital budget for IT. In the current scenario, we're looking at $1.6 million for the year. It's really covering a lot of, making up for a lot of backlog in terms of upgrades, et cetera. And so, when you put this all together, it's 4.7 million. When we look to see, well, where can we find another $500,000, $1 million? It's tempting to look at this category. We could cut back, but, just understanding that when we do that, the deferred maintenance falls more behind, the IT and cybersecurity needs fall more behind, and so I think that we just need to be careful about this. So we're trying our best to maintain this level of investment on this campus. It's pretty necessary, but we certainly can look at this if we need to. So any questions about this piece? Okay, so if we can go to the next slide, please. It's really so just a reminder, sir, in terms of the use of reserves, so back in FY 21 and 22 is when we leveraged our HERF funding for the purpose of extending that pathway to recalibrate the budget over multiple years instead of having sort of a shock to the system, let's say, big cuts in a particular year. So, it's allowed us time to recapture some lost enrollment, which we're seeing this year, which is very helpful. And, a less painful, gradual and less painful alignment of resources with enrollment. So, in FY 23, we allocated 4 million in the budget. It turned out we didn't need that in FY 24. So this year we had the $2.5 million allocated. It looks likely that we will not need that. But, in the draft budget, in the budget for FY 25, we've, got the $2 million slotted, and, we do intend at a certain level to use that or some of it. And I don't know what we'll bring to you in terms of which draft of the budget, but just wanted to put that out there as a reminder that that might be part of our strategy for reconciliation for 25. And I think that's all I have for you, but want to see what other questions you all might have for us.
No questions for me. I think the feedback you got here was good for the setup for next month's first draft. But in terms of questions, I don't have any other questions.
Me neither.
Allow me to say thank you. In talking with Trustee Starks, right, the term was level set. The idea that there's a lot of information here. And I really appreciate with the committee a chance to kind of level set a lot of work and diligence that has been invested in sort of building out this approach, this model. We'll put this deck in front of the full Board of Trustees for Monday night. We clearly won't go into it to this level of depth. So to the opportunity to know that it will be socialized with the full board, but really, really appreciate the amount of time and investment you put into knowing how have we tried to prepare, right? What are the conditions that we're trying to work through? Really, really appreciate all of your feedback tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, team. Appreciate the efforts. This is it's not easy work. We understand that clearly. Okay, I guess with that, unless anyone has any other comments or questions there, we have a discussion with committee trustee priorities. Is that who's spearheading that discussion?
I think that
was more right, Andrea. Just if there was anything else that you wanted to be sure that we heard from all of you, help as we level set here, but then give you a draft next month. We were just letting you know we're all ears.
Oh, got it. Okay. All right. So I guess that means one last chance if anyone wants to include anything if you missed it.
I think I said I'm good.
I'm good too.
I don't know if it's a question or a comment. Have we modeled kind of a spending out of the reserve, like a spending policy versus just a plug the gap each year?
In terms of what we would use the reserves for?
No, like how we would access the reserve. So if we have a long-term fund, could we, and now that it's built up, could we consider kind of a spending policy type thing to fund operations a bit? And have that be a continuous revenue source for the budget? I mean, it might not be big enough, but I didn't know if that was, or do we just sweep like interest and dividends right to operations? I mean, do we have that in the budget? Like that could be another stepping stone.
Yeah, that's a good point. One of the interesting things is that reserves, so we keep thinking that reserves is like what's in our investment accounts, but given the way we define reserves here is whatever's left over, it's
Right.
so it's like it's even if it's not in investments, even if it's in TD Bank, if it was, the sort of surplus at the end of the year, essentially, then, it's considered reserves. And I might need to stop and see if John Tudrin wants to sort of jump in and explain that in, more technical terms, or we can do that offline,
We can do that offline. Yeah.
I get your point, and I think there's like some nuance in terms of the distinction between sort of how we're using reserves here and then sort of what we have in terms of what's coming out of the investment accounts.
Okay. Okay.
I was
Thank
even
you.
going to say, Mac, you're going to have to help us where this is a recent phenomenon, even to be able to have the luxury of Lori of having this conversation.
Yeah.
Trustee Stark started in 2015. We maybe had touched reserves once, and it was for a capital project that was the first one in 30 years. And then we only touched it prior to COVID one other time because we had an emergency on a IT core switch. So this is a very recent phenomenon to have this level of consideration, flexibility, right? It's very, very new, Mac, if I have that right.
No, you do have it right, but I do like the approach to, have some governance or some sort of this is a situation where we would use and what percentage we would use, and because I'm sure where Trustee Martin is going is we got we're staring at $5 million in 2027, right? I mean, do we really want to put $5 million of reserve up in 2027, right? So can we box that somehow where we come up with some rules around that? But I do like that approach. But you're absolutely spot on, Dr. Cook, in terms of where we're at today versus where we've been in the past.
And if I can just also add that we fully intend to have a balanced budget in FY27 without the need for reserves. And so, that's what we're aiming toward. And so, we're hoping to, if we need reserves, to have that as a backup for FY25 and then less for FY26. But our goal has always been, to get that balanced budget in 27. So unless, there could be surprises that could impact that. And it's good to know that we have money in the bank that, could be used. And also, the sort of management of long-term versus short-term. So how accessible are those funds? I think we're starting to really develop a, more comprehensive picture of that. So I do think it's a great idea to look at like what those policies are. And also, I just want to remind everyone that we do have, the plan to use $11.5 million from reserves for the ship's relocation project. And that's something, trustee designated use of reserves. And so whether it's something big like that or something that's smaller, like supporting operations, we are coming back to trustees for that every time. But just a reminder that we do, have that sort of expected expenditure coming, in the next couple of years.
It's a good point, Andrea, that any excess funds we have is going to be put into facilities. And we know that there's that 3-year plan with state money and you working with DCAM to move out of the old building into other programming for better education. All of that is a 3-year transition. So, you can throw 27 out with the bathwater. It's 25 to make sure we're on board on how we're going to do it. And let's see what 26 and 27 looks like after that. And let's look at the variables from there. But there is a lot of moving parts. But we have to make sure the programs for our students are where they need to be, and exiting a building that was not functional for us. There's a lot of things that are there. And we did not have a facilities meeting in January. We didn't have a quorum. We will have one. We'll look forward to an update to the board, probably not this meeting, but the following. So you can kind of bring that into play as well as we get through the budget process. But I think we have a great starting point. Thank you.
That's well said, Trustee Sadler. So moving on, there's no old business. Is there any new business that we need to address this evening? Okay, hearing none. Our next meeting is March 11th. And before we take the roll, I do want to echo Dr. Cook's comments earlier that thank you for your flexibility. Last week's meeting, was postponed to today, but I appreciate the flexibility in meeting today. And with that, Nene, could you please take the roll to adjourn the meeting?
Yes, Max Stark,
Yes.
Samalid Hogan, Laurie Martin,
Yes.
Norm Roldan,
Yes.
Jeff Sattler.
Yes.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Nene. Thank you all. Have a great evening.
Thanks again, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks.